We're not just coming together as a community to welcome this new baby. We're not just gathering to wish the baby well. I mean, those are all good things. But the sacrament of baptism is something objective. When I was involved in full-time pastoral ministry many years ago, St. Paul the Cross Church outside Chicago, one of my favorite things to do were baptisms. And I put baptisms there in the plural because they hardly ever took place one at a time. Typically when I would baptize, there'd be 10 or 12 kids. So I would come out 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. There'd be all the families gathered up in front of the church. I would do a little kind of introduction and welcome. And then almost on cue, the 12 babies would start crying all at once. And so amidst this happy cacophony, I would kind of shout my way through the various prayers and baptize the babies. But it was always a joy. I love doing baptisms. And I must say, since becoming a bishop, I don't have that many opportunities to baptize, and I kind of miss it. But an exception took place just, a couple weeks ago now, when I had the privilege of baptizing Hazel Rose Cummins. Hazel is the daughter of Doug Cummins and his wife Erica. Doug is the associate producer here at Word on Fire in Santa Barbara. So we gathered over at San Roque Church, which is sort of my local parish here in Santa Barbara. And it was a wonderful experience. But I want to share with you a little bit of what I shared with the small crowd gathered there that day. I first talked about what I'll call the objective side of baptism. And I used as my point of departure this now kind of famous case of Father Matthew Hood. You probably heard about this. Young priest from the Archdiocese of Detroit. And the Vatican recently came out with a statement saying that, to be validly baptized, you have to be baptized with the pouring of water or sprinkling, and then the words, I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, so Father Hood is young enough to have been baptized at a time when there were video cameras and so on. And he went back and watched the video of his own baptism and discovered, to his unhappy surprise, that the deacon in question who baptized him didn't say, I baptize you, but rather, we baptize you. Now, you say, well, it's just one little word, but see, there's a world of difference there, because when the minister is baptizing, he is not operating in his own name or in the name of the community or of the local parish. He's operating in persona Christi, we say, in the very person of Christ. The I, therefore, is the I of Christ who baptizes. Okay. Well, once he discovered this, the poor young priest went to his archbishop and said, Archbishop, I think I wasn't validly baptized. And indeed, that was the case, which in turn meant he didn't receive First Communion, because you've got to be baptized to receive First Communion validly. He wasn't validly confirmed, because that requires baptism. And he wasn't validly ordained, because that depends, too, on your being a baptized person. Well, long story short, the archbishop, in short order, baptized him, gave him First Communion, confirmed him, and then finally ordained him. And you say, well, okay, that's, I guess, a happy ending to kind of a quirky story. But my point again is, there's something objective about baptism. Through these gestures and these words, something happens. That's the theology of the church. We're not just celebrating a grace already present. We're not just coming together as a community to welcome this new baby. We're not just gathering to wish the baby well. I mean, those are all good things. But the sacrament of baptism is something objective. The classic definition, a sacrament's a visible sign of an invisible grace. In this sacrament, through this sacrament, a child or an adult becomes a member of the mystical body, is now adopted, becomes a cell, a molecule, an organ in the mystical body of Christ. Something objective happens. If it's just a celebration of an already existing grace, or it's just the welcome of the community, well, then I'd paraphrase Flannery O'Connor and say, well, then the heck with it, So the case of fatherhood, I told the folks gathered there, is a good way of reminding ourselves of this objective density to baptism and to all the sacraments. But then, having said that, and not for a minute unsaying it, I said there's also a subjective side, and here's what I meant. I did it through appeal to an old story, because there were a lot of little people there, a lot of little kids. So I wanted to draw them in. And I told that familiar story of the egg that rolls out of the nest of an eagle. And it falls to the ground, but it rolls among a group of chickens. And so the eagle is hatched, but he doesn't know his eagle parents, his eagle siblings. All he knows is the world of chickens. These little birds, pecking around the ground and never flying and living in a very, narrow range. And so the eagle, who's born to fly and to soar and to cover hundreds of miles, grows up pecking the ground and never flying. Well, then I continued, according to the story, one day a great eagle flies past and looks down and sees amidst these chickens this eagle. And he comes to the ground and he says to him, "What is the matter with you? Why are you pecking around the ground like a chicken? You're an eagle." And the eagle is, "Well, I don't know. I've never seen this. I never realized my own capacities." And so then the adult eagle draws him into that world and teaches him how to spread his wings and how to fly. So I told the folks gathered there, this little baby objectively through this sacrament receives the grace of adoption and becomes a member of the mystical body. Something happens, that's true. But now, the task of the community gathered around this child is to remind her in every way who she is. See, my complaint, I told them, is that an awful lot of baptized people in our country, around the world, are in fact children of God. They are in fact destined to be great saints. They are in fact destined to soar. But the problem is they spend their whole lives pecking around the ground like chickens. What I mean here is they imitate not the great saints. They imitate, whatever the popular culture is throwing up at the moment. They seek wealth and power and pleasure and all the little petty goods of the world. And, that might make you great in the eyes of the world. That's like being a great chicken when you're meant to be an eagle. See, so I told them, look, that's your job now. That's your job, is to remind this little girl throughout her life who she is. And she's meant to be a great saint and not a pathetic simulacrum of what she's supposed to become. So that's how I read together the objective side and, if you want, the subjective side of baptism. And I'll close with this. As I mentioned, still I think it's true that most people in our country are baptized Christians. Most people are objectively sons and daughters of God, meant to be great saints. The trouble is most of us are pecking around the ground like chickens. If every baptized person in this country realized who he or she is meant to be, that'd be the true American Revolution. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, I encourage you to share it and be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel.
You've been talking a lot lately about the Second Vatican Council. So I know for me personally, Vatican II it's huge. But as you know, too, there's resistance to the council that's emerged, and it's getting a bit stronger. Initially, it seemed like just like an online conversation, but now it's seeping into the parishes. Where do you think this resistance come from, and why do you think the council really is actually the response we need?
Well, a first observation is this. As a Catholic, you can't be opposed to an ecumenical council gathered, as they say, cum petro et su petro, right, with Peter and under Peter's authority. There's no higher authority in the life of the church than an ecumenical council gathered by the Pope and under his leadership and with his approval. And so it's just bad ecclesiology. It's just bad Catholicism to say, oh yeah, Vatican II, we should dispense with that. What you have heard from people today, with that view, I have zero patience. And I think no priest should have any patience with the view that we can somehow dispense with, or pick and choose what we like from a council. As I argued, why not do it with Chalcedon and Trent and Vatican I? So I have zero patience with that. Now, where's it coming from, some of this frustration? I get it. The church has got all kinds of issues and problems. We just lived through the sex abuse scandal. We've gone through, in the West, I want to point out, in Europe and Canada, America, and so on, we have gone through a decline in different areas of the church's life. And so people get frustrated, they get angry, and it's a convenient target to say, there it is, this big council. Prior to the council, everything was great. Then there's this great decline. The council is the problem. Well, let's get two problems, both in formal logic. One is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, right? Because it came after, it must be because of. And so there's that tendency to say, oh, well, these things happen after the council, therefore the council's to blame. The other logical problem is the fallacy of singular causality. So we can find one great cause for all the troubles we're having. The decline in certain areas of church life in the West is a very complex phenomenon and is caused by all sorts of factors. A couple observations. One is, look at the church in Africa. The post-conciliar African Catholic Church is flourishing, is booming. And trust me, it's not based on a nostalgic return to the Latin Mass. I mean, I've been to Africa and seen African liturgies. To me, it's a beautiful example of the rich enculturation of the faith that Vatican II was about. Look at the church in parts of Asia where it's flourishing. There is a kind of myopia of a lot of people in the West to say, well, looking at our culture and our society, things look grim in certain ways. So I think you've got to get past that and accept a much richer account of how we, in our part of the world, got into our situation. So those are a couple of general thoughts about it. The bottom line is we can't be distancing ourselves from or calling radically into question an ecumenical council. Better to find the authentic purpose and meaning of the council. My great mentor, Cardinal George, always maintained Vatican II was a missionary council. Its purpose was to bring the lumen to the Gentiles, the lumen being Christ, bring him out to the peoples of the world. So bring Christ to the modern world. It wasn't a radical rethinking of our doctrines. It wasn't. There was no need for that. Vatican II is not a rupture with the great doctrinal tradition of the church. It was more of a missionary council, and therefore, yes, indeed, had a pastoral focus, I would say, to bring Christ to the nations. When we read the texts under that rubric, and we read them carefully on their own terms, I think we find a very rich articulation of what the mission still is, So anyway, I'm very impatient with this dismissal of Vatican II, which I think is inadmissible for a Catholic and represents a very immature appreciation of the council texts themselves. So end of harangue on that.
Like, it's very difficult to talk about obedience because immediately people think like, well, should you be obedient to McCarrick? Should you be obedient to this? Could you say a few words maybe about the Catholic understanding of that, of obedience, of proper authority in the church?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have a hierarchical church. And so, as we priests know that when you're ordained and you put your hands within the hands of the man ordaining you, and do you promise obedience and respect to me and my successors? And I did that with Joseph Bernardine in 1986. I had no idea who Francis George even was at that point, but he became one of his successors, and I was obedient to him. And so, I mean, that structure is fundamental to Catholicism. Now, are there limits to it? Sure. You don't obey someone who's commanding you to do something that's intrinsically evil. So you've got an authority figure, and you're beholden to him, but he's telling you to do something that you know to be morally objectionable. Of course, there's a limit to that obedience. Would a priest, let's say in Washington, when Cardinal McCarrick was Archbishop, and he's giving him, his assignment, is he obliged to obey him? Yeah, sure. If he's telling him to do something immoral, of course not. So it's not a sort of blind or unquestioning, uncritical obedience. It's not I'm just following orders kind of obedience. No. There's a moral limit, spiritual limit. If your superior is telling you to renounce your Christian faith, well, of course you don't obey that. So no, there are clear limits to it. And I get people's frustration. I mean, trust me, I wrote a little book about it called Letter to a Suffering Church about, the frustration of the Catholic people that I feel as a Catholic. I mean, before I'm a priest or bishop, I'm a Catholic, and my own frustration with what I called a rot in the priesthood, not that all priests are rotten, but that there was something the matter, there was something the matter in the priesthood, and there was something the matter with the leadership of the church that allowed this thing to flourish as long as it did. So I have no hesitation naming all of that and raising my voice that it would change, and that laity and priests and bishops should do all they can to make that change. So I have no quarrel with that, but none of that speaks against obedience in the legitimate spiritual sense, that I'm under obedience to a legitimate authority who's commanding me in a way that is not repugnant to morality or the spiritual life. I guess that's how I'd put it,
Okay, my question is, how much do you go into the weeds about this and that doctrinal thing? But part of me feels like this is actually more of a spiritual problem, more so than intellectual. Or
no, let me just stay with that for a second, because I think it's like someone is so angry that they burn down their own house with themselves in it. You know what I'm saying? So am I angry at McCarrick? Am I angry at the rot in the priesthood? Am I angry at the terrible abuse of authority that took place in way too many cases? Yes. And am I going to wield a torch to try to burn that stuff down or burn it out? Yes. Or like a good surgeon to go in and cut that out. What you don't want to become is a firebrand who takes and I'm going to burn the whole house down, and I'll go down with it. Or be such a ham-handed surgeon as I'm cutting out the cancer, I'm also destroying every organ in the body. That's the trouble, frankly, with some of the rad-trad crowd. I think that, yes, they're angry. I get it. I'm angry too about these things. But you don't burn the house down. You direct your anger appropriately and prudently so that you can excise what's problematic. But that's why, like, an attack on the Second Vatican Council, that's burning the house down. Because you burn down Second Vatican Council, what's going to stop you from burning down the Council of Trent or the Council of Nicaea or Chalcedon? What's going to stop you? As I've said before, you've adopted a fundamentally Protestant ecclesiology. And now I know you think you're Mr. Uber conservative Catholic, but you become a Protestant effectively. If you're saying, my private judgment has authority over a council, I can decide based on my own private whim what's acceptable or not in a council, that's called burning the whole house down. So don't burn the house down, just burn the things that need cleansing. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So that's my second harangue. But that's what I see. And what you're drawing attention to, I think, in a good way, that's the problem. Or the old image, you're sawing off the branch that you're sitting on. So I'm so angry at some of these dead branches, but I'm going to cut the whole tree down that I'm sitting in. So anyway, that's the problem, it seems to me.
My question is going around along these lines. Why was the council really called, and what needed to be fixed?
Well, take this as a starting point. So you've got, 2,500 or so bishops gather from all over the world at Vatican II, the largest conciliar gathering in history. And the votes, I think the closest vote was Dignitatis Humanae was like 2,300 and something to 70. That was the closest vote there was. The other documents are all like 2,450 to 5, right? Yeah. Look at the lineup. My point there is, in 1962 to 1965, 2,500 bishops from all over the world overwhelmingly voted for the Vatican II documents. That tells me something. That tells me that they felt something was needed. There was a development needed, I say doctrinally and pastorally. It's naive in the extreme to say, gosh, everything was great. Just go back to 1957, everything was just great. Well, then riddle me this. Why did all these men overwhelmingly vote for the Vatican II documents? I could see if the votes were really real close, there's a lot of debate. There was debate, to be sure, but once they worked through the text, they overwhelmingly voted for them. That tells you a lot about what they perceive the need to be. Now, what was it? Read the documents. Go through them one by one, and you'll see exactly what they felt needed. In our understanding of the church, to get away from maybe a hyper hierarchical, totally priest-centered view of the church to this much more, holiness of all the laity and the missionary purpose of the church and all that. That's what they saw the need to be. Go through the documents on priesthood, the documents on the laity. You'll see what they thought needed addressing. Now, the implementation of it, how people read and implemented those documents, that's a whole other issue. And I started my career as a writer criticizing the implementation of Vatican II in our country. So I'm certainly sympathetic with that. But I'm not sympathetic with the view that everything was hunky-dory in 1957, and then anomalously, the overwhelming majority of bishops all over the world made this massive mistake called Vatican II. With that, I have no sympathy.
This is the question that seems to be the center for a lot of people. How can we move forward in this discussion? And is there a possibility for asking these questions around, was the reform, did the reform happen as the council intended it?
No, and I think a good way to do that is to reread the document. Let's get a group of priests, maybe older and younger, together. Let's read together Sacrosanctum Concilium. Read it. I bet even a lot of priests, if they ran their eyes past it, maybe it's a long time ago, sit down together, maybe get 6 or 7 of you, have a nice dinner, and you're going to read together Sacrosanctum Concilium. And what does that tell us about the nature of the liturgy, the reform of the liturgy, what were clearly excesses in the way that the document was implemented? What are paths forward? Ratzinger's book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, from not that many years ago, I think is an attempt to do that, is to revisit Sacrosanctum Concilium. I would recommend that. Going back to the texts. I think in a way the Vatican II texts have been the most ignored, maybe. And one reason for that, to be honest, and here I'd be a bit critical, not of the content, but of the form. The Vatican II documents are egregious in the history of the Church, in the measure that they're more like extended essays than pithy doctrinal statements. So you look at Vatican I, you look at Trent, certainly, and there's a tendency just to kind of get to it and name it and define it. Vatican II chose the more expansive essay as the vehicle for communication. Well, there's a shadow side of that. The good side is obvious, that it's probably easier to read, it's more lyrical, it's more inviting, less, officious. The shadow side is it's susceptible to greater interpretive range, right? If you have an extended essay and using more imagistic language and so on, it's open to a wider range of interpretation. So that's the shadow side, if you want, of the form that Vatican II chose. But I'd recommend going back to those texts and in a docile spirit, read them again. Because my point there in talking about the form was I think they weren't read. People got this big text, the documents of Vatican II, and it's like, oh gosh, how am I going to get through this whole thing? Read them one at a time together. We have the 60th anniversary coming up, right? In 2022 will be the 60th anniversary of the opening of Vatican II. Not a bad time to revisit those texts. What worries me, I must say, at the present moment, what's worrying me the most right now is this hostility toward Vatican II. Now, to be fair, the extreme right is doing that. The extreme left, too, has always been, in its own way, uneasy with Vatican II. And so, I say a plague on both your houses, and read Vatican II. And it's not going to give you the rad-trad extremism. It's not going to give you the liberal, let's, just surrender to the world project. It's Vatican II in all of its integrity, its theological richness, its spiritual depth. The greatest spirits of the 20th century in Catholicism produced those texts. The Bouillets and the Ratzingers and the Ronners and the Wojtyłas and so on. I mean, the cream of the crop intellectually produced those texts, and then under the aegis of the bishops. That's a high moment in our Catholic history. And those who for different reasons and with different ideological purposes want to dispense with those texts, plague on both your houses. And let's go back and read those texts lovingly and carefully.
Great.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming on, Bishop Barron. We really appreciate the
My
discussion.
This was awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, I encourage you to share it and be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel.